Hello, and thank you for this privilege of offering some thoughts and contemplations on soil carbon. I made my first measurements of soil carbon now almost 40 years ago on samples taken from these old historical rotations established in Lethbridge in 1911. In those days, we studied soil carbon for what we then called soil quality, driven by our desire to preserve and enhance sometimes dwindling soil productivity. But that impetus, that motivation shifted profoundly. It changed abruptly with the specter of climate change from rising CO2, which really emerged into our consciousness in the early 1990s. And with that issue came the dawning realization, belatedly perhaps, that carbon in the soil is connected to carbon in the air, which means that how we manage the carbon in a farm field resonates far beyond its fences. And so people began to wonder. Scientists began to ask, can we perhaps pull down some of that excess atmospheric CO2 and store it away, stash it away in the soil where it might have some benefits? And so was born the science referred to as soil carbon sequestration. And this aim has now become widespread, worldwide, as seen in the growing number of research publications devoted to this subject globally. And while the subject has been intensely studied, many questions remain. Uncertainties, ambiguities still linger. And that's certainly what I found in my own research career. The more I learn, it seems, the less I know. The more I write about soil carbon, the more I speak about it, the more I try to publish about soil carbon, the more the questions emerge and the bigger they seem to be. And on reflection, maybe that's not entirely surprising, because soil carbon dynamics are part of the biosphere, which really is the most complex system we know of. It's beyond our comprehension, certainly far beyond anything I can comprehend. And if nature, says Sharon Butala, the novelist, if nature has anything to teach us at all, her first lesson is in humility. And so from that vantage, my purpose in this presentation is not to instruct or to enlighten or to educate, but rather I offer these thoughts in hopes of educing your thoughts, of eliciting your conversation, of soliciting our collective wisdom into a cohesive narrative. And I aim to do that by posing questions very deliberately designed to promote mutual learning. I will say at the outset that I offer no final answers. Indeed, what I say will almost certainly be incomplete, and some of it may well be errant. It may be erroneous, wayward. But I think that's how it must be, because this is how we learn, by probing beyond what we know, exploring areas beyond our understanding. As the poet puts it, in order to arrive at what you do not know, you must go by a way which is the way of ignorance. So let me proceed then with questions, 5 questions, as mentioned, intended to elicit your thoughts, your observations, our mutual learning. The first question I want to ask is, why store carbon? That seems like a fundamental starting place. I've already mentioned 2 important motives. The first is to preserve soil productivity. The second is to mitigate climate change. Now, these are crucial, critical even. But I think perhaps the benefits are even wider. even deeper and longer. And that leads us to thinking again about ecosystems by adopting the ecosystem perspective, where I equate an ecosystem more or less to land. It's not just the soil, but the air above, the water flowing through, all vegetation, all biota, people among them, in all their myriad entanglements with one another and their habitat. And these ecosystems, these lands, serve many functions, both for humanity, but also far beyond. Yes, they offer us food and fuel. They serve to buffer our climates. But beyond that, they offer habitat for the creatures we love. They store and preserve biodiversity. They filter our air. They filter our water. They lift our minds and renew our spirits, among other things. And I will argue that all of these functions, one way or another, are tied to the flows of carbon through soil. Now, to ponder that a little further, let's just step back and remind ourselves of some fundamentals. We ask ourselves, what is it that drives our ecosystems and fuels all their functions? It is, of course, the sun. All the things that we see that are moving, says a physicist, are moving because the sun is shining. Your very thought, this moment, coursing through the neurons of your mind, are propelled in the end by the stream of photons from the sun. So we talk a lot about carbon. We measure carbon. But we look at carbon as a carrier of energy. As I read in my first ecology text, carbon is so closely tied to energy flow that the two are inseparable. All our wizardry aside, all our technological gadgets notwithstanding, photosynthesis remains the most important energy conversion in the biosphere. It is the process that pulls carbon from the sky, then imbuing it with energy from the sun before delivering it as biomass carbon into the soil, into the ecosystem, there to drive those functions, creating this eternal circuit, in Hall's words, creating this energy circuit, or as I have spoken of it elsewhere, this river of sunlight that courses through the land in an endless cycle, driving all of these functions. From this perspective, then, the ultimate use of land is to capture solar energy to support life, human and non-human. And in fact, when you think about it, that's what farming is all about. That is the essence of farming. To lay out these sheets of green, these solar panels designed by nature, which harvest the sun's energy. And that energy then is directed beyond the ecosystem to serve as food for us and our animals, to fuel our automobiles and industry, all the while remembering that the ecosystem is sustained by that same energy. So we always want to be sure to return enough of that energy, enough of that biomass carbon back into the ecosystem, back into the land, back into the soil to sustain the continued life and functioning of that important system. And as already implied, soil carbon is central to these cycles, central to the so-called eternal circuit, conferring upon it this resilience, this capacity of a system to maintain function in the face of inevitable disturbances. Soil organic carbon, looked upon another way, is really this massive pool of stored solar energy that serves as a flywheel, keeping that eternal cycle spinning, keeping that wheel of life turning through inevitable intermittent energy pulses. To change analogies, to use a different metaphor, soil organic matter serves like a battery in a renewable energy grid, keeping the lights on when the wind stops blowing and the sun stops shining. And our intent then in managing these lands is to keep that battery charged. Our aim in managing land is to use wisely this buffer, this pool of energy, both for current uses, but always setting aside enough to maintain future functions in the event of upcoming upheavals and disturbances. By preserving and enhancing soil carbon, then, we maintain the capacity of land to impel all these functions we've talked about, of maintaining this river of sunlight flowing through. And from this perspective, then, soil is not just a reservoir, it's also a catalyst, a bioreactor. It's not just a tank for excess atmospheric CO2. It's also an impeller, a dynamo, sustaining these flows of energy. And from that viewpoint, then, what counts is not just how much carbon we have stored, but also its nature, how active it is, how alive it is, how well tuned it is to the functions expected of a unit of land. And for this role, soil carbon then must be dynamic, not static. And we imply from that, we infer from that as well, that the optimal amount and nature of soil carbon really varies from place to place. It depends on the conditions and the expectations in each unit of land. So in summary then, why store soil carbon? I have been suggesting that the overarching aim, the overarching motivation is to maintain active and functional ecosystems, to maintain all of these functions, yes, including also this role in mitigating climate. I think this wider perspective, perhaps, might lead us to thinking beyond sequestration, perhaps toward stewardship. That is a change in orientation from a linear view to a circular view. Sequestration sometimes implies this linear flow of carbon from atmosphere to soil, whereas stewardship, I suspect, implies this circular flow that needs to continue indefinitely and into perpetuity. Everything the power of the world does is done in a circle, said an indigenous elder. Now that leads us to a second question. How do you store soil carbon? In principle, at least, the answer to that question is quite straightforward. It's a matter of mass balance. Soil carbon accumulates when inputs of photosynthetically derived carbon exceed losses from decay and affiliated processes. It's like a bank account. If you want to increase your savings, you either have to increase deposits or impose a restraint on withdrawals, or do both. Now, in early stages of ecosystem development, generally carbon losses lag behind carbon input, and so stored carbon tends to accumulate in the amount of the cumulative differences between the two. Eventually, however, the rate of carbon loss converges upon the rate of carbon input, and the system approaches some kind of pseudo-steady state, some kind of quasi-equilibrium, although a true equilibrium is rarely attained because always there are perturbations from things like weather events, for example, or animal activity. Now in croplands, the most drastic perturbation, the most profound upheaval, usually is the initial conversion to cropping, which almost invariably leads to a loss of soil organic carbon. In the soils that I'm familiar with, at least, such losses typically amount to about 20 to 30% of that initially present in the surface layer. We ask then, why do these losses occur? Almost inevitably. And our instinctive initial response, I think, is to say, well, it's the disturbance. It's the actual tillage, breaking down aggregates, and so on. And of course, this is true. But I think there may be a more fundamental underlying reason, namely the suppression of carbon inputs. After all, farms are very deliberately designed to be extractive, to generate as much carbon that is destined for harvest and export. And so our cropping systems are designed to remove carbon, leading to reduced inputs and yielding a transition of a system based on carbon investing to a system based on carbon export. It's a transition from an energy investing system to an energy exporting system. Or to look at it another way, it's a shift, generally, from a system based on perennials to a system based on annual. And perennials, we know, are particularly adept at capturing carbon. Indeed, they're often used by nature as a foundation of enduring, resilient systems. Perennials are good at harvesting energy from the sun for at least two reasons. First of all, they have an extended duration of photosynthesis. They're always there, ready to capture energy from the sun. When the sun first thaws the ground in spring, the perennials are there to catch those first warming rays. And when a rain suspends a summer drought, the perennials are there to resume their growth, to resume their photosynthesis, resume their carbon capture. A second reason is that perennials have evolved to persist year to year to year. And so they have evolved to invest in the land, to invest in the future, notably by allocating large proportions of their photosynthetically derived carbon below ground through extensive rooting systems. What that means then is that when we revert our croplands to perennials, often we see a soil carbon gain over time, as we've seen in a number of long-term data sets. The difficulty, of course, is that many of our food systems now rely on annuals. Indeed, I might add that we rely on annual crop species that have been deliberately selected and bred to maximize harvestable carbon, to maximize exported carbon. Now, there's a lot of work underway in many places to develop perennial grain crops. But until those efforts reach fruition, the best we can do often, as a contingency, is to reconfigure our cropping systems to mimic perennials, recomplicating our lands, diversifying our cropping systems deliberately, intensively, creatively. For example, through more elaborate crop rotations, through including cover crops where applicable, by judiciously reintegrating animals back into our cropping systems. In short, keeping the land green, capturing energy whenever, wherever possible, and always maximizing the amounts of carbon returned directly in crop residues or indirectly through recycled carbon in the form of manures and other organic amendments. Now we could present a long list of practices that increase soil organic carbon. But in general, any practice that increases the rate of carbon return or slows its decay will tend to increase soil organic carbon. To cite just one specific example, crop nutrition obviously often enhances soil carbon reserves, whether that crop nutrition is achieved by applying fertilizers or manures or leguminous residues. Generally speaking, those additions will favor soil organic carbon by enhancing photosynthesis, enhancing yields, and hence allowing for more return of carbon to the soil. We might, however, at this point, emphasize that there is no single recipe for enhanced soil carbon storage. There is no universal list of best management practices because best depends on where you are and who you are. There will be no one size fits all solutions. And so the best we can do often is patiently, humbly, to listen to the local land, to heed the local wisdom of farmers and ranchers and farmers and foresters. And gradually, slowly, we're also learning to heed the long wisdom of indigenous people, who after all have a much, much longer history on the land than most of the rest of us do. Another caution, in the words of Ehrenfeld, is to beware of experts. Experts like me. Be aware of experts. Too often we are people who are extremely knowledgeable about narrow systems. And to that caution, we might add a corollary. Be aware of labels promising panacea. Always, I think, we're reminded to think about the underlying restorative principles rather than becoming too focused on prescriptive practices and prescriptive buzzwords. Always we're reminded that we're still all learning together. A third question. How will we know when we have stored soil carbon and exactly how much carbon we have stored? This is a question that has long vexed me. And it vexes me still because measuring soil carbon change is not easy. To reframe an old adage, measuring soil carbon change is not rocket science. It's much harder because soil carbon is variable. And the differences in carbon from place to place on a landscape often far exceed the responses we are looking for in response to a management regime. It's hard enough to see and verify changes in small research plots. But what do we do when a landscape looks like this? When soil organic carbon varies in every nook, every knoll, every hollow? How many samples do you have to take? And how do you amalgamate those samples and those analyses into something meaningful? Beyond that, changes are often slow. Often it requires years, even decades, to verify the changes in response to a management practice. Given this gradual rate of change, our only recourse often in measuring soil carbon change is to settle in for long and patient listening. In assessing soil carbon response to management, time is the final arbiter. Time is the final judge of our management practices. And so it is not surprising that much of what we know about soil carbon responses comes from long-term experiments. These are so-called listening places. They're places where we press our ear to the earth, straining to hear time's murmurings, slowly gradually, patiently revealing its verdict. These plots shown here and mentioned earlier are a tiny remnant of the remarkable foresight, the astonishing humility shown by our predecessors. At one time, more than 100 years ago, we in Canada had a splendid network of sites spanning the country. Those in the prairies in particular were very deliberately envisaged as a network, with 23 systems in all, many replicated across sites, many established on virgin soils, and many of these systems under evaluation, deemed even by today's stringent standards, would be considered innovative, progressive, visionary. And it's clear from reading the original notes that these predecessors clearly envisioned these as long-term sites. It will require the evidence of many years, wrote Mackay in 1913. They are part of a long-time study, wrote Palmer in 1940. And so they took careful notes, recording practices, and they even set aside soil samples for later use, beginning in 1910. So today we can go back through the use of these archive samples, following the changes in carbon over the long decades, over time periods now exceeding a century. We can go back and make analyses like carbon-14, and for example, by extraction of DNA, methods that could not possibly have been foreseen by those who established these sites. Well, sadly, almost all of these long-term sites have now gradually disappeared. But rather than mourn their loss, I think we might devote our attention instead to asking, what sites do we start today? What sites, what benchmarks will be needed by those coming after us? What sites should we be conceiving and implementing to outlive us? Because I think if we want to improve soil carbon over the long run, we will need to know with some confidence when we have done so. It's quite clear, I think, that we will always need models to estimate regional changes. But these models, if they are to be credible, if they are to be reliable, must be instructed by long-term measurements. Unfortunately, such monitoring does not usually win glittering prizes. It does not always even generate a lot of publications for our resumes. But still, the question remains, will we be able to verify in 2050, for example, the targets we set today? I'm starting to think if we are going to project future soil carbon changes in our agricultural lands, we may need to establish today the means to verify when and if and to what extent they've occurred in the future. Fourthly, we may want to ask, where should we seek to store soil carbon? Farmlands, we know, are not uniform landscapes, which means that the potential for soil carbon storage and the benefits derived from such enhanced soil carbon are not the same everywhere. An obvious place to begin, perhaps, are the degraded soils. These are the soils that often show the highest rates of potential carbon gain. And they are the soils that are likely to benefit most from such increase. And we have data enough from long-term experiments to show that a soil devastated is not irretrievably lost, but rather such soils can reaccumulate carbon over the long term. After all, says Wendell Berry, the soil is the healer and restorer and resurrector. Nature often rebounds from perturbations. Soil carbon can slowly reaccumulate after perturbations if we are wise enough, patient enough to allow and foster such self-healing by the soil. So the obvious place to start, I think, when we are considering soil carbon storage are the degraded areas, the degraded soils. But there are other places, I think, often overlooked. And that leads us again to adopting an ecosystem perspective, to looking at the entire ecosystem, to look beyond the fields, to see also the margins, the wetlands, the hedges, the edges, the roadways, the so-called idle spots, in Leopold's words. Bailey, writing in 1915, said, "These supposed waste places may be very real assets. We shall learn this in time." Well, maybe the time has come. And maybe that invites us to look beyond our manicured fields, to look beyond our plots and see the whole landscape and ask, can we increase landscape? This takes us then to potentially re-envisioning land, to ask, what do we want our lands to look like? Can we restore, to some extent at least, landscape heterogeneity? The idea, in Charles Elton 1958 words, the idea of actually planning a better and more varied landscape. And now we start to imagine multifunctional landscapes. We start to envision perhaps mosaics within which different places are tuned for different functions. Different places, different settings are managed, are optimized for different functions. Some places might best serve as carbon sinks, restore natural areas, for example. Others might be managed for intensive food production. Still others for maintaining biodiversity or filtering air or filtering water. Still others for aesthetic appeal, for recreation, and so on. And in this way, by creating these mosaics, the entire landscape can promote all of these various functions in a cohesive, contiguous arrangement. And in all such thinking, using the poet's words, we should not forget to consult the genius of the place. We should not forget to consult the soil, which really, after all, is an unbroken skin covering the earth. And so we are able, we hope to at least, read the soil, its variations, its undulations, its changes over the landscape, to see what it knows about which functions might be optimized where. And when we adopt this approach, then, the variability that we sometimes so bemoan may not be an obstacle after all. Maybe it becomes an opportunity for reading the soil to see which functions are favored. After all, the soil, and specifically soil carbon, is the memory of ecosystems. Soil organic carbon is life in repose. It is the remnant of life past and the origin of life to come. And so what we do in our analysis, in our thinking, is to probe those memories etched in carbon to see how the ecosystem once was, but also to seek hints, to seek inklings of what is yet to be. And further, to evaluate just how well we are performing, we who are living on the land. We flourish and fade, but the soil stays, and the soil remembers. One final question, one that I am least qualified to address, and yet one that I think is important. Namely, how do we engage a wider audience in our contemplations of soil carbon and the wider carbon cycle? Farmers and ranchers, we know, are on the front lines of carbon stewardship. But we all live on land. Whether you live on a foothills ranch or in some condominium in a tower of glass and steel, you live on land. Land gives us food and fuel. One way or another, it absorbs and recycles all our waste. We all live on land. Writes James Rebanks, a farmer. Everything that happens on a farm is shaped by a host of powerful external forces. We are pulled to and fro by invisible threads. Somewhere, those threads are connected to how you shop, eat, and vote, as they always have been. The carbon flows that we've talked about connect us all. No one's excluded. We all benefit from them. And we're all responsible one way or the other for sustaining them. We are, after all, carbon-based creatures, firmly, inextricably embedded in these flows. This means that choices made in boardrooms, in classrooms, in living rooms, in grocery aisles profoundly affect these flows. This takes us again to move from linear to circular thinking. Linear thinking takes a problem, identifies a solution or a practice or a policy, and then offers those solutions for adoption. Circular thinking, on the other hand, envisions people and land tied together, one touching the other in an endless learning cycle. As Wendell Berry says, for people and land cannot be destroyed or conserved except together. The problem, of course, is that there has been a growing disconnect between many people and the soil. We face a paradox. Collectively, we're increasingly dependent on the benefits of land, but increasingly disconnected, increasingly oblivious of these benefits and our responsibilities. The problem then, said Aldo Leopold, is how to bring about a striving for harmony with land among a people, many of whom have forgotten there is any such thing as land. Well, I meekly suggest that these carbon flows, these carbon stores, these carbon dynamics we've talked about, offers us a built-in narrative to remind each other of our dependence on land. A narrative that speaks of streams of carbon atoms coursing through land, some fast, some slow, delivering energy from the sun, binding together all inhabitants, sustaining them in futures uncertain. If we take this perspective, then perhaps our legacy will be not just teragrams of carbon stashed away. Our legacy, what we leave behind, will be also restorative stories seeded into human minds. And that is an opportunity. That's a privilege that we engage in together the crafting and the dissemination of this narrative. And it's a crucial opportunity, I think, because as the novelist says, in the long run, a people is known not by its statements or its statistics, but by the stories it tells. Well, let me end with a specific question, namely, how important is soil carbon sequestration for mitigating climate? I'm still wrestling with the question. But for now, my evolving view is that it's potentially significant. Building reserves of soil carbon to extract excess atmospheric CO2 is a laudable, a worthy goal, and we should do everything we can to advance this objective. But at the same time, I think we remind ourselves that this strategy is insufficient alone. And maybe it's best to view land as an ally in this venture, but not an alternative to other processes and strategies. More than carbon sequestration, I've argued here, stewardship of land carbon, looking at carbon dynamics more widely is more crucial than ever before for reasons, yes, including climate mitigation, but also for reasons far beyond this specific function. Because our biosphere, our home on this planet, is faced by all manners of troubles. Yes, there is climate change, but also there's loss of biodiversity. There is social disharmony. There is the ongoing, growing demand for food and for energy, for clean water, and so on. Resolving all of these issues, as we've argued here, depends on maintaining the flows of carbon and energy through our ecosystems. And these flows, we've said, depend on functional lands founded on soil carbon that sustains them. And that leads us then to thinking about maintaining soil health, which elsewhere we defined as the vitality of a soil and sustaining all these social and ecological functions of the enfolding land. What this means then, a soil is healthy to the extent it promotes and steers efficiently the stream of solar energy, this river of sunlight flowing through land. And so building soil carbon is something we do to promote health, to promote all of these ecosystem functions. Then the question emerges, where do we start? In the face of these vast problems, which sometimes seem a little abstract, where do we start? Well, says Wendell Berry, found your hope on the ground under your feet. You know, we tend to want to fix ecosystems instead of learning to live within them. And so maybe the way to start is, as Watson and Watson suggest, choose a place. Choose a unit of land that you care about and maximize the likelihood that it will outlive us. Improve its function by tending the soil, by storing carbon, by maintaining those carbon flows, and then gradually passing it on along with its stories. As James Rebanks, the farmer, says, our farm solves nothing on its own. It is just a little place where we make our start. And making that little start may be the most important thing we can do. And so we foster the flows of carbon in our soils, yes, to mitigate climate change, but more widely to ensure our lands and their inhabitants present and future, flourish despite the upheavals which are certainly coming. So we focus on soil carbon. We focus on carbon in the soil as a lens through which we see ways of living well on land, thereby sustaining it for all who will depend on it now and tomorrow. I'm grateful for your attention. Thank you.